A few things to note in looking at Fort St. John Baptiste is the outline of the fort. The entrance you can see in letter N is to the riverside, which none of these trees would have been there. They would have been cleared off with complete access into the fort. The warehouse keeper's quarters is located next to the entrance for a good reason, so he could receive and ship goods as needed. One more thing to note in the fort design is P through V are the officers and enlisted quarters. V is the modern bathroom, and more than likely a well, or the outhouse, or privy as they called it back then, was pretty close to where the living quarters were. Wells were also dug for water, but the wells and the privies were often dug pretty close together, and so many times the water was contaminated because of the privy. And so when people went to drink the well water, they got sick. And so germs, bacteria, viruses really had not been discovered most of the 1700s. So people didn't understand why they got sick. They just knew the water made them sick, and so therefore they wouldn't drink the water. So instead, people drank fermented and brewed beverages such as beer, ale, cider, and wine. On average, an adult would drink a gallon of ale a day. So people in colonial times believed alcohol was good, water was bad. Many doctors prescribed and sold alcohol to their patients, and alcohol was consumed at social events, including business meetings, court hearings, and auctions, and just kind of hanging around the fireside. At funerals, it was expected alcohol would be served, and typically in a large pot placed right directly on the coffin. So the home you see here was moved to its current location by the fort staff, and it was reconstructed as an 18th century style home. Now, colonial homes were usually small, as their main purpose was sleeping quarters. And so most homes would have outdoor kitchens, and that includes storage areas. So colonial life activities such as trade, cooking, and home life are told as based on the life of Joseph Verger, who was a colonial trader born in Paris. So woodworking, like any other colonial trade, was vital to the settlement. And so it was not uncommon for colonialists to have builders, people who could do cabinetry, and roofers that would specialize in certain woodworking skills, techniques, and methods. And so by the 1730 in Natchitoches, there were at least 4 different contractors who were building homes in different styles. Now, anvils have been around since ancient times. Anvils are used to forge and shape metal. The first anvils were made of stone, and then they went to bronze, and then wrought iron, and then steel-faced wrought iron, and now they're made of all steel. Their shape has evolved over the years, but they're really made to do specific jobs. So Fort St. John Baptiste, like most French forts, were designed by the king's engineer. So before construction could begin, the engineer had to, of course, design the fort. There were 5 major factors that had to be considered in designing the fort, which were topography, strategic purposes, tactical advantages, of course, nature of weapons that might be used against the fort, and any existing structures. So Fort St. John Baptiste was built to withstand light artillery using a form of log construction called stockade. So frontier forts were typically had 1 row of stockade forming that fort walls, but this fort was an exception. It was constructed as a 2-walled system that could withstand light artillery attacks for a short period of time. Of course, the cannons were primary to any fort. and it was an important part of the defense of the fort, your supplies, everything else. So the cannons that are shown here, they fired what was called 6-pounders, and that entire cannon weighs 1,700 pounds. This is the entrance to the fort as you go and visit. Of course, would be the back of the entrance. As we said earlier, the front would have been towards the river. And there you can see the double stockade. The warehouse contained many necessary supplies to be issued to soldiers. Food, of course being a necessity, would be cooked outdoors, and so iron skillets and pots were issued, so that way soldiers and officers could actually make meals. Other goods that were prepared for travel were often placed in barrels of assorted sizes, as you can see there. Sugar, beans, salt, other kind of items like tools and ropes, candles, dinnerware, cured meat, anything that you could fit in a barrel for travel was fit in some way or the other. Sometimes the soldiers were also paid in goods instead of coin because, there wasn't a bank just around the corner where they can go do payroll. So an important part of anyone's wardrobe is shoes. And so shoemakers were first making shoes to what you see here is called a wooden last, or blocks of foot-shaped wood carved that were in different sizes. And so a leather upper would be stretched over the last and then fastened with glue until it was ready to be then fastened to the sole. The sole would be pounded with a metal tool, and an awl would be used then to cut holes. Once all that was done, an upper was removed from the last, and the sole and the upper were sewn together before the shoe was cleaned. It was polished and fitted with a heel. And finally, the shoes were hung in the shoemaker's store, and a standard pair of shoes would take that person 8 to 10 hours to make. And so early shoemakers also made the shoes from the same pattern, meaning that the left and the right shoes were exactly the same. The guardhouse was placed close to the warehouse and the powder magazine to supply the guards with the items they needed. And so in the guardhouse, each room housed about 8 people with bunk beds to maximize space. So at the fort there were about 55 soldiers and officers assigned to the fort, so space mattered. However, most of the soldiers lived off-site and it was manned very sparingly. So the jail was used for slaves being transported to other locations. It was used for prisoners and also for soldiers who liked to break the rules. Now these clay ovens were made from a mud mixture and Spanish moss. So not unlike the wood brick ovens of today, these ovens would be used to bake many items including bread. So the coals were used for fire and would be shoved to the back of the oven or removed to place the items to bake inside the dome. And so then the door to the oven would be attached so the items could then cook from the radiant heat. And then you pulled out this fresh, warm bread. Most colonists and soldiers were French. Therefore, Catholicism was an important part of life for soldiers. By 1732, a chapel was constructed on the fort. The original plans were found for all of the buildings, and then the fort itself was completely reconstructed in the 1970s. However, when a priest was away or not assigned to the post, priest from the Spanish fort Los Adios would then come in and offer mass. They would perform weddings and funerals, And of course, they would baptize infants and converts if there were any. The quarters served as the home for the fort commander, but St. Denis lived off-site like most of the men. The furnishings in the barrack is what a typical commander's quarters may have resembled. The sideboard contains a variety of pewter and ceramic ware, which was typical for the times. Of course, a fireplace would have been standard and used to heat the room and also for open hearth cooking. The room also contained a bed and a desk and other items that, of course, a commandant might need. So the officer dining hall and the barracks were used to house their own quarters. Depending on the fort, there could be a single bed, there could be bunk beds. It just really depended on the size and how many were there on site. They at least had another room which doubled as the officers' mess and the room for recreational purposes, but at least it wasn't a kind of all-in-one room situation. So the barracks were for the enlisted men. This is where everybody else stayed. You had one room, you slept, you ate. For recreational purposes, everything was done in this room. So when I first walked into this room and saw this mannequin, I wasn't quite sure what to think, and then I realized, what it was, and its purpose, of course, is so you can see life in 17th century or 18th century. So again, you did everything there. There were the beds you can see off to the side. Food, everything was done right there in the same room. I can imagine possibly 8 people in the same room trying to live and not not fight each other. Here you can see how the beds were constructed, so you didn't have much privacy at all. So the powder magazine building is where the stored muskets and cannon powder, along with firearms, ammunition, and grenades, this all would be stored in this building. And most of the time, the building would be placed in the center of the fort to protect it. But this powder magazine building was at the back of the fort. Anyways, the walls of this building are 8 inches thick, and the roof was not nailed down in case of explosion. So it's better to blow the top off than the walls, which then would limit the damage to the magazine itself and, of course, the fort. Of course, a modern bridge was constructed over the river. That was an important river for waterways and transportation as well. Signs are all over the place. It was an important part of colonial time and getting around to and from places. And then there were numerous maps and drawings from the original area. Of course, it's all in French because obviously the French settled it. And then you can see other documentation from goods being sold or brought into the fort, and other items, documents, maybe decrees, I don't know, I don't read French, that were found on site. And this is in the museum that you can find on site. So if you recognize this home from the movie Steel Magnolias, this was one of the centerpieces of that movie. However, that home was given as a land grant by the Spanish government to its first owner, and which was actually prior to the completion of the Louisiana Purchase. And so the first mention of this home was found in courthouse records dating about 1841, but it was built prior to that date. And so it was built by two Italian architects, and they had bricks imported from France to use in the construction of the home. And so the home was intended to use as a store, since it was on a prime location on the Cane River. Some say that during the Civil War, the building was used as a hospital and was rumored to have played a part in the Underground Railroad. The house shown here is called the Judge Porter House. It was built in 1912 by Judge Thomas Fitzgerald Porter and his wife Wilhelmina. The home was located on a property that once stretched from the 2nd Street to that Bayou Amulet sign that you saw earlier in the video. There was another lodge there called the Blunt Lodge Hall. It was an existing building that was already located on the property and was carefully dismantled piece by piece so that the materials could be used for the construction of the current house, which only took 3 months to build at a total cost of a mere $1,500. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.